America warns it will isolate Russia if it doesn't back out of Crimea. But here the UK government inadvertently shows its hand and lets slip its ruled out military action and tough financial sanction. No wonder he looks confident and in command as he watches the Russian army flexing their muscles.
Here in Sevastopol, Ukraine says Russian forces have surrounded all of its bases on the peninsula. Russia denies giving the Ukrainians an ultimatum to surrender by morning or else.
We'll be live in Kiev asking the new Ukrainian government what they're going to do. And we'll hear from John Mcain and voices from around the world on where the crisis goes next. The Education Secretary tells us he doesn't care how posh his cabinet colleagues are, even if the voters do.
It's an English disease to pay too close attention to where someone went to school.
And from Benefit Street, White D. Has the show changed her life? What does all this fame mean for her benefits? Hello, good evening. Reports tonight that Russia has issued an ultimatum to the new government in Ukraine to surrender or face full military assault. In fewer than 5 hours, that ultimatum, then denied by Russia, runs out. Well, tonight, we'll be asking the interim government how it intends to respond. Earlier, President Obama warned Russia it was on the wrong side of history and threatened to isolate the superpower. But here, a document has accidentally revealed the UK government's hand and shown it's unwilling to contemplate any military action or even take tough financial sanction. We'll ask if the West has any power in this conflict. But first, Gabriel Gatehouse has been monitoring events in Crimea. He joins us live. Gabriel.
Well, it's less than 5 hours now till this supposed ultimatum runs out. The Ukrainians say they've heard from the Russians. They've been told their bases, which are now surrounded, will be stormed if they don't vacate them by 5 a.m. local time. The Russians say this is absolute nonsense and they've got no intention of doing any such thing. Whatever the case, this has perhaps had the desired effect of making everyone very jittery indeed, especially inside those bases. Interestingly, talking to ordinary people here, despite all of this going on, many people genuinely do feel pleased towards the presence of Russian forces here. But they know this is very, very tense, and they know that any spark could ignite something, and nobody here wants a war. We also heard today, again from the Ukrainian authorities, about a supposed build-up of Russian troops on the east of the peninsula, just across the isthmus inside Russia. So the prospect of many more Russian troops possibly coming over here. Whatever the case of that, we shall have to see tomorrow. But in truth, we've been travelling round the peninsula and seeing that Russians have plenty of their own forces here already, and many of them seem to have come from the Russians' Black Sea Fleet base here in Sevastopol.
Not a shot has been fired. But in years to come, historians may well write that this was how Russia took back Crimea. What would once have been normal, everyday scenes have now taken on a more frightening aspect. Russia's Black Sea Fleet leases its base here in Sevastopol from the Ukrainian government, or at least it did. Now its forces aren't guests anymore. They've become the masters. On the road out of Sevastopol, checkpoints have appeared. These are apparently manned by civilians, but they're flying the Russian flag. Moscow's control now extends across the peninsula. Ukraine says all of its military bases have been surrounded. We were at Perevalnoye, south of the capital Simferopol, shortly after the troops arrived. The Ukrainian commander emerged from negotiations with his unseen Russian counterpart. I asked him whether any of his men were prepared to surrender. No one's surrendering, he told me. Ours is a Ukrainian brigade, and that's that. And so the standoff began. The Russians have called on the Ukrainians to vacate their bases. For now, they're holding out, with essentially their prisoners behind their own gates. The Russian troops are well armed and clearly well disciplined. Their uniforms give no clue as to their identity. but no one is in any doubt who they are. And many are glad they're here. We don't want people to come here with their Molotov cocktails and create chaos like they did in Kiev, this lady tells me. These people are here to keep us safe. But not everyone is in agreement. An argument broke out when one man suggested that the Russian soldiers were essentially an occupying force. He was quickly shouted down. As more Russian supporters arrived, Ukrainian soldiers watched nervously from the top of one of the buildings. When we returned today, reinforcements seemed to have arrived, and yet more flag-waving supporters blocking movement on and off the base. And so the Ukrainian troops are relying on locals to replenish their supplies. We watched a Lada deliver shopping to the besieged Ukrainians with the tacit agreement of the Russians. Every soldier understands the need to eat. Everyone knows perfectly well whom Crimea belongs to, says the bringer of tinned food. I can't imagine these guys are pleased to be here themselves, he adds, pointing to the Russians. These men are Crimean Tatars. Almost universally, the Tatars fear a Russian takeover. To understand why, you have to come to this place. Bakhchi-Sarai, capital of the Crimean Khanate, when the Tatars ruled this peninsula from the 16th century. All of that came to an end with Russia's southward expansion under the Tsars. But for many Crimean Tatars, this sleepy town is still their home and a repository of their cultural history. Catherine the Great's conquest at the end of the 18th century is celebrated here as a great historical event, one that would put Crimea within the Russian Empire for more than 2 centuries. But for the Crimean Tatars, who built this as their capital, that annexation was simply the beginning of a number of historical tragedies that befell them under Russian rule. Baba Shura is 81 years old. She was 11 when in 1944 Stalin ordered the entire Tatar population deported. He suspected them of collaborating with the Nazis. Shura and her whole community were herded onto freight trains bound for Uzbekistan. The memory is still painful. The Tatars only returned after Ukraine gained its independence from the Soviet Union. Shura says the thought of another conflict with the Russians is simply unbearable. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, she says. Just let there not be war. This evening, Ukrainian naval officers began barricading themselves inside their main headquarters in Sevastopol in anticipation of a possible Russian assault. Earlier, they'd gathered in the parade ground to hear an appeal from their new admiral not to heed Russian calls for them to abandon their posts.
They tried to break our lines of communication, to break our lines of supply, and they do a severe psychological pressure on our personnel to betray our motherland.
Many Crimeans are deeply suspicious of the new government in Kiev and the way in which the previous one was overthrown. Russia may have lost an ally when Viktor Yanukovych was toppled in Kiev, but in a sense, they got what they really needed out of him. One of the first things Yanukovych did when he came into office in 2010 was to extend Moscow's lease on this base right into the middle of this century. Now, there were those Ukrainian politicians, especially on the nationalist side, who argued against that, who said that this base was a Trojan horse. And so, indeed, it's turned out to be. Not for the first time in history, Crimea finds itself at the epicenter of a conflict between the great global powers. But while the West scrambles to calibrate a response, Russia is busy creating facts on the ground.
Well, that was Gabriel Gatehouse. And in Washington tonight, could we be seeing signals of a tougher stance? President Obama's ambassador to the UN promised to stand strongly and proudly with the people of Ukraine at the UN Security Council meeting tonight. And we're going to cross now to Washington and speak to John McCain, the former Republican presidential candidate, who sits now on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator McCain, thanks very much for joining us. Are you hearing tough words from America tonight?
Oh, I'm hearing a lot of rhetoric. So far, the only action to be taken is to boycott the preparatory meeting to take place of the G8. There's a lot of rhetoric, but I frankly don't see a lot of action. What
do you think should happen?
Oh, I think we should do a lot of things, beginning with a fundamental revamping of our policy towards Vladimir Putin. Our president has been incredibly naive in his dealings with them. He wanted the reset, the overheard conversation with him and Medvedev saying, tell Vladimir I'll be more flexible. There's statements just in the last couple of days, this is not East-West, this is not Cold War. Vladimir Putin said the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. He believes this is East-West, he believes that it's Cold War, and he believes that Crimea, and particularly Sevastopol, is essential to the near abroad, the old Russian Empire, which he continues to seek.
How do you respond then to Western powers who will rule out military engagement or indeed tough financial sanctions?
Well, I rule out military action. It's just not an option that would be viable, frankly. And this is the result of 5 years of naive relations with Russia, not the beginning of it. If the Europeans decide that the economic considerations are too important to impose severe sanctions on Vladimir Putin, which is you get from the statement by Angela Merkel today, then they are ignoring the lessons of history. You know, if Vladimir Putin is allowed to take this Crimea because of protecting, quote, Russian population. Do you remember back in the 1930s when Hitler took Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia because of German population? And finally, could I say there are significant Russian populations in the Baltic countries, in Poland, in Romania.
Except
so we
Russia
can't
will
allow
say,
such a thing.
Except Russia will say at this point that the West stood by whilst a democratically elected government in Ukraine was overthrown, not even stood by, supported that coup.
I think that when you see what Yanukovych did with his dashas and with his corruption and his repression and killing of people, he forfeited all legitimacy in the eyes of anybody who has an objective view. They can say that pigs fly, but the fact is Yanukovych forfeited any claim he may have had to governing the country.
Tonight we saw documents from the UK government inadvertently that showed that they were not for now supporting trade sanctions or closing the financial centre to Russians. Is that the right approach?
Of course not. Of course not. But I am not astonished, to be very frank with you, disappointed, but not astonished. I think we can, here in the United States, enact an expanded Magnitsky bill, which targets people with sanctions and with penalties who are responsible. We can renew the missile defense systems that we abandoned in attempts to appease Putin in the Czech Republic and Poland. I think we can do a lot of things, if necessary, unilaterally.
Okay. Senator McCain, thank you very much indeed for your time for joining us this evening. Well, our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, joins me now. Laura Kuhnsberg has also been looking at the market implications, which we'll come to in a second. There is diplomatic embarrassment here, certainly, for the government, Mark, from those documents that were spied that essentially removed some key tools.
Well, you've got a situation, and let's face it, it's not a new one, where the members of the EU, in particular, there was a foreign ministers meeting today in Brussels of the EU, cannot agree on a way forward. You've got Poland in particular, in both the EU and NATO, insisting that people address this question and do so in a resolute manner. On the other side of the equation, we know in today's EU meeting, Germany, Italy and the Netherlands were all against taking sanctions against Russia. And then, of course, having heard all that, we then see these documents glimpsed on the way into Downing Street for a National Security Council meeting, excluding, on the one hand, anything that would have a negative effect on trade relations between the two countries, and then, with regard to what NATO might do, ruling out even planning for some sort of military preparations. So even the sort of window dressing, if you like, was ruled out by the British government. In this situation, once again, we look at precedents like the Balkan Wars. People will look to the Americans, and judging from the language being used in the UN tonight by their ambassador and by President Obama today, there's more likely to be some substantive American movement on this issue, perhaps Magnitsky Act preparations or clauses, as Senator McCain was referring to, perhaps something that goes to the G8 issue, but I think we should look to Washington in the next day or two on this.
And Laura, I'm wondering how relevant any of these threatened sanctions are from bodies, from governments, when the facts on the ground in terms of the markets are so stark.
Well, as the diplomacy grinds away rather ineffectively, the markets are completely different. They're live beasts. And if you like, today we've seen a pretty harsh verdict on what is going on, and indeed on Putin's credibility. The ruble fell to record lows. Russian stocks had huge amounts of money wiped off them. And actually on the streets in some Russian cities, there were stories of exchange booths where you go to buy dollars or euros or whatever, running out of those two currencies, as some Russians themselves sought to go and try and get their rubles out and turn them into a safer currency. And, you know, we are kidding ourselves if we think this is somehow happening in isolation. One former director of the Bank of England told me he thinks it's certain that Ukraine will default. One of our biggest companies, BP, for example, huge stakeholder in Rosneft, the biggest oil company in the world, it lost huge amounts of money from its value today. That affects one of the Britain's biggest companies. And the biggest thing, you know, is oil prices. Already in the last couple of weeks, they have been shoved up. And that has an impact on almost everything. Our FTSE was down today, the German market, French market's down. The markets are nervy. They don't know exactly what they're looking at, but they don't like it.
And this is hurting Russia too. What then does Putin's endgame become? I mean, we've heard the Sudetenland analogy. It's been used several times. Where do you think this is going?
Well, the whole question is so replete with history. We saw in Gabriel Gatehouse's report the sense in which Ukraine, Crimea are part of Russia's history. Of course, there are people in Russia who want to reabsorb the country. That's clearly not on the cards in the near future. I think the key thing that Russia wants in the near future is to have an important influence in the shaping of this country and of the government that follows. Some people think they're trying to get the constitution turned into a more federal one where, for example, Russian speakers in the east of the country have far more latitude, and through this that Russia can continue to influence decision-making in Ukraine. But as for the Crimea, with its separate status even now within the Ukraine, well, the question has to be open as to whether that will be, in some sense, absorbed by Russia.
Thank you both very much. Well, that's the theory. What do those on the front line make of it? Joining me down the line from Kiev is Ukraine's interim economics minister, Pavlo Sheremyta. Thanks for joining us. Was there an ultimatum? What did you understand by that earlier today?
Good evening. Can you please repeat the question once again, because I couldn't hear it?
We understood there was an ultimatum issued from Russia.
Well, it seems like the ultimatum has expired and nothing serious has happened. So we survived another ultimatum. It's not the first one. Most probably would not be the last one.
How do you read what Russia has done so far?
Well, we read that as if that is not an intervention, then what is?
And how will you respond?
Well, we respond like we responded during the last week, keeping the calm. We believe that this escalation has to be de-escalated exclusively and only through the peaceful means, through negotiations, through the discussion. We want to figure out, what is the reason of this escalation. Ukraine is governing itself. It discusses the issues like any other nation discusses in a democratic way. So we don't really understand why Russia is so concerned.
So Russia is on your military bases. Do you call that negotiation?
Well, we do not particularly like the fact that Russia is at our military bases because it should be at its own military base.
How far will you let Russia go before you take action?
Well, we really hope that Russia will cease these actions, these unfriendly actions. I mean, come on, like we lived together virtually peacefully almost through the whole history that we had. We are brotherly in a way, Orthodox nations. So I think that it's some kind of we treat it as some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Russia did not read properly the signals and the events that are happening in Kiev. For some reason, they took it as the offense against them, as like as if we are moving completely westward against Russia, which is absolutely not. What was happening here on this main square in Maidan is our absolutely internal issue. We were just protesting against the corruption and against the violation of human rights and actually, killing human lives. So that's what we are protesting against.
Let me just clarify then. It sounds from what you're saying like you are ruling out any kind of military response to what is going on there now. Is that right?
The Ukrainian government does not plan to use any kind of military response because we do not believe this is the right way to solve this issue. This issue should be solved only through peaceful means. We are being provoked already for 5 or 6 days, and I really commend the calm and the strength of the Ukrainian forces that did not allow to be provoked.
Pavlo Sheremetyev, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's hear now from the Kremlin former advisor Alexander Nekrasov and Min Campbell, the former Lib Dem leader, also on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. We did have the former US ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, but he's sadly just left our studio without an explanation. Perhaps we can shed a bit more light on that. Alexander Nekrasov, you have heard the charge against you, 5 or 6 days of provocation on sovereign Ukraine land. What is Russia doing there?
Well, first of all, you're forgetting that we've had a coup in Kiev, which was financed, encouraged, and by the way, Senator McCain was there as well during the protests, encouraging those protests to continue.
With protesters killed on the streets, we remember.
Yes, and protesters shooting at police. And by the way, 20 police dead means that protesters were armed. So we have to stop and count the dead people. And I think the problem here is this. Everybody is asking, what is President Putin's end game? And I would like to ask in return, and what is the West's end game? And what is the end game of that government in Kiev, which has no mandate, which is boxed in because it was waiting for billions to come from the West at once, and it's now not knowing what to do. And by the way, about that ultimatum that all day the Western press was banging on about, there was no ultimatum. It was denied at once by the Ministry of Defense in Russia, which said it's nonsense.
We understand.
And yet it was reported and reported all day. You are showing the Security Council of the UN gathering. You know who called for that meeting? Russia. But not a mention, not a word anywhere.
OK, well, let me ask you to set something in 1 second. Yanukovych apparently wrote to Russia saying military action is advisable in the Ukraine and Crimea. Is this what's happening?
No. Yanukovych, what he wrote doesn't matter. Yanukovych was the legitimate president and he was overthrown by a coup.
Well, what he wrote, if he was a legitimate president, then what he wrote was obviously of significance. What do we want? We want the people of the Ukraine to have the opportunity to determine their own future without the influence of Russia. And of course we know, last time round it was Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There's always an excuse for intervention for political reasons. One thing I would like to say, though, is that I think it's inexcusable that the United Kingdom should find itself in a position where yet again a document being carried up Downing Street is able to be photographed. It's particularly significant in this case because since military action is ruled out, then there aren't very many shots in the locker, but economic sanctions would be one of those.
So that was foolish on 2 counts?
Indeed. I mean, you show your hand. In a diplomatic exchange of this kind, uncertainty is enormously important. It's enormously significant. And particularly when we hear that the Moscow Stock Exchange has collapsed and the ruble's under severe pressure, the economy is the soft underbelly of Russia in this matter.
I wonder how you think this is going for Putin now. When you look at the state of Gazprom shares or the ruble, do you think this is going according to plan?
Putin had to respond. It would have been political suicide for Putin not to respond to a Western-backed coup in Ukraine. So that would be a disaster.
A Western-backed coup.
He responds to the views of the people.
Yes, but the fate of the people of Ukraine should not determine on the credibility of President Putin. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's been breach of the United Nations Charter. Article 2, they're talking about regime change. That's what they're talking about. And these are the very people who, when it came to President Assad's regime in Syria...
It's a bit rich to talk about Ukraine when we had Iraq, we had Libya,
it was Putin that stepped in on Syria, so let me Campbell finish his point.
You can't talk like that about Ukraine. When on your conscience there's Iraq, there's Libya, there's Syria.
Listen, I've got a conscience about Iraq, and I will not take any challenge to the contrary from you. But these are the people who, when it came to trying to deal with President Assad's regime, said or went out of their way to veto or said they would veto any suitable United Nations resolutions. Why? Because they said it would amount to regime change. They're practicing regime change at this very moment.
There is no moral authority with Putin's actions. It looks like bare-chested thuggery, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't, because nobody's planning to invade and nobody's planning to change anything.
So this is not invasion?
Of course it's not an invasion.
What do you call this when you occupy or you stand on the edge of every single military installation?
An invasion I would call what happened in Kiev when armed thugs were killing policemen and interior troops. Have you heard any single shot fired in Crimea? Anyone hurt or anything? And the reason why the bases are surrounded, because in other cities in Ukraine, they stole arms from those bases.
This is a very strange set of affairs, though, isn't it? We have not had one shot.
Well, that's a good thing. We shouldn't be surprised about that.
Of course, I'm responding to Alexander Krasov
but because in circumstances like those we're talking about, provocation or miscalculation can result in a shot. And if we had one shot, then we would probably have a conflagration.
But does it tell you that Putin's approach to this is actually a benign one if he doesn't want to make war with the people of Crimea?
Well, I must say the use of the word benign in these circumstances does rather take me aback. Look, the garrisons are being surrounded. People are being told by their commanding officer they've got to give up their loyalty to Kiev, give up their loyalty to Ukraine, and subordinate that loyalty to Putin and those who are acting on his behalf. That's not benign in any circumstances.
Where is safe, then? Where is safe? If Crimea is not safe from this kind of approach, where else in the Ukraine is safe? Are there any borders to where he'll go?
Well, Crimea is a specific part of the country, because not in single time in the past, the people of Crimea were given a chance for a referendum. Khrushchev, a murderous thug, just threw away Crimea to the Ukraine. You know why? Because he killed so many, presided over murders of so many Ukrainians, he had to give them a present. Nobody asked the people of Crimea about it. Then, after 91, nobody asked them again where they want to be. They were just given to Ukraine again.
No one asked the people of Georgia that Abkhazia and South Ossetia should have been the subject of Russian takeover.
And we have to speak to Mikhail Saakashvili.
They were provoked
with American money and American weapons.
They were provoked into doing it, you know that.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you both very much. We understand that John Bolton had a prior engagement which he had to hurry away to. The English are obsessed with their old school, suggested the Education Secretary today, calling the habit an English disease. Michael Gove defended the number of Aldertonians in the Cabinet, but said it was indefensible that so many actors, pop stars and board members were privately educated. He dismissed critics of his reforms to state schools as being, well, a bit dim. But as far as higher education goes, on a visit to the Formula One manufacturer McLaren, he told Laura Kunsberg that middle-class parents ought to aspire for their children to become apprentices instead, and demanded that businesses provide more places.
Secretary of State, you've said this morning there's no excuse for businesses now not to take on apprentices. What happens if they don't?
Businesses said in the past apprenticeships have been too bureaucratic and the method of funding apprenticeships hasn't necessarily suited us. Well, we've removed that. There's now no excuse. And if businesses choose not to engage, then I think that they'll have to justify themselves in the public square.
Should there be any comeback? I mean, you say they ought to justify themselves in the public square, but yes. What do you mean by that? Should there be comeback for those who don't want to engage?
I certainly don't think it should be the case that we should penalise them, because it's in the self-interest of any company to engage with the apprenticeship programme. But I do think that we should ask business what they're doing in order to play a bigger part in our education system. In policy terms, I would say this was a nudge or a dunt rather than a direct intervention. And it's certainly the case that if you look at a Rolls-Royce or a British Aerospace apprenticeship, entry to them is more competitive than entry into a Russell Group university. So in many respects, for many young people, an apprenticeship is a superior option to going to university, because it provides you not just with the experience of the workplace, not just with an income, but also in many respects with a level of intellectual challenge greater than that of some universities.
But many apprenticeships are not in that sphere. Today, advertised on the internet, swathes of apprenticeships that are essentially what would have been jobs that are currently being advertised as apprenticeships, paying £2.98 an hour. Are you really saying you want parents to aspire to that for their children in the same way they might aspire for them going to university?
Yes, I think that it's absolutely right that parents should want to ensure that their children have the option, certainly, to go to university. But at the same time, I don't think that there's anything wrong, and there's a lot that's admirable about saying that you want to experience the world of work.
You are, though, in a sense, also trying to change aspiration. You, in your speech, made a link between vocational and academic education and working class children and middle class children. So this is a class issue, isn't it?
Well, we've had, I think, a damaging view in this country that success, narrowly defined as academic success, is only available to a limited number. As you know, that view doesn't hold and hasn't held in other countries, from Scotland to Singapore. It is not a class issue, it's an England issue, and it's one that we have to overcome if we're going to make sure that every child achieves their full potential.
That's specifically an English issue in your view?
I think it's an English problem that we've not valued the practical and the technical in the same way as we value the academic. And I think it's an English issue that we have an unequal education system with opportunity distributed in such a way as to mean that children who go to independent fee-paying schools and the best state schools have many more opportunities than children who've gone to other state schools. But that is changing.
Some people might suggest, Joe, the picture has gone into reverse around the cabinet table. Even many of your own MPs believe that the very top bracket of politics, the cabinet table and the Prime Minister's team, is far too dominated by those who've been privately educated.
Well, it's a consequence, isn't it, of the education system that we've inherited. David Cameron isn't responsible for the school to which he went, neither is George Osborne. The fact that we had social mobility go backwards in this country was a consequence of some mistakes that we made in the education system in the 60s, 70s and 80s when we were growing up.
Are you suggesting there aren't people with equivalent abilities in the rest of the Conservative Party? Because there are many Conservative backbenchers who argue this is a problem.
Well, there are certainly people who will. It's an English disease to pay too close attention to where someone went to school. But since we are, if you are sitting around the cabinet table, then some of the voices that are most influential come from those people who have not come from gilded and privileged backgrounds. Is it defensible to have so many FTSE 100 company boards staffed by public school boys and public school girls? Is it defensible that so many of those actors or pop stars or sports stars to whom our children are encouraged to aspire come from private schools? Of course it's not defensible. Therefore we need to change.
Does it disappoint you, though, in that whole context, that the warm-up for the next Conservative leadership contest, which is evidence all over the place right now, also seems to be playing out between two public school boards?
I'm not aware of any speculation about any leadership other than the choice between David Cameron and Ed Miliband.
Haven't you been reading the newspapers?
No, I've been working hard. I mean, you'll have to acquaint me with what the speculation is, but as far as I'm concerned, the only leadership question that counts is whether or not we want to have David Cameron or Ed Miliband leading this country after the next election.
You described in your speech this rather extraordinary place as being a bit like a Bond villain's lair. Do you care that quite significant swathes of the educational establishment, professional people, see you as a bit of a villain in terms of what you're doing? Does it bother you?
I don't go out of my way to solicit or to invite opposition, and you'll never get unanimity about any set of political changes until after the politician driving them through has long left the field. And the argument that I find is that people say sometimes your changes are too great in scope or being introduced too rapidly. But no one that I'm aware of has been able to argue against higher standards in our schools, more autonomy for head teachers, more rigorous exams. So the opposition, which you allude to, tends to be the inertia of defenders of the status quo rather than a focused intellectual dissection of anything we're doing.
Okay. Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Michael Gove. She was the biggest thing to come out of Benefit Street, a Channel 4 reality show that showed one street in Birmingham that rocked to fame or infamy. Tonight we ask White D, the self-styled mother of the street, what she made of the show and how it's changed her life and her community.
Here's my cup. Yeah, I am what the cup says, grumpy.
She's been variously described as the Queen of Benefit Street, a one-woman citizens' advice bureau, and the patron saint of drug users and dropouts. Deirdre Kelly, better known as White D, became the star of Channel 4's Benefit Street with her forthright advice on everything from staying sober to dealing with the benefits office.
I've suspended your claim as there's been a change in your income. Do you know, hand on heart, don't worry about it.
But the self-proclaimed mother of James Turner Street, a convicted thief who's been out of work for 7 years, has divided opinion and generated headlines almost as much as the series itself. Since its broadcast, the show's triggered an impassioned debate about everything from the exploitation of poor people for entertainment, the rights and wrongs of the welfare system in its entirety, and whether the show's protagonists were misled about the nature of the programme.
They were very clear and transparent with everyone on the street about what the nature of the programme was, why they were there and what the nature of the end product was.
So what does the unlikely celebrity at the heart of it all, now complete with a PR manager who calls her a working-class hero, really make of how she and her neighbours were portrayed? And with rumours about a music recording deal, a Big Brother appearance, a plus-sized modelling opportunity and even a tilt at becoming an MP, what next for White D and her benefits? Well, Deirdre Kelly or White D joins me now. Which do you prefer?
Obviously Deirdre Kelly or
Deirdre
D.
Kelly.
Kelly, yeah.
How has your life changed over the last couple of months?
My life, it hasn't changed in the way that I'm still, you know, a mum of 2 children. But it's like being thrown into the limelight when you're just not used to it at all is just a real shock.
Does it feel like things have got better or worse?
Busier. I wouldn't say better. It's you know, everyone sort of knows you now. The street's just turned into a bit of a tourist attraction. You cannot drive up and down that road on a Saturday or a Sunday.
So this is the poverty porn in action, is it? Do you understand why that phrase came about?
Not particularly. I mean, you know, we still dispute the fact, and we would argue to Channel 4 that at no time whatsoever did they tell us it was in any way related to benefits. We regard poverty porn. We don't class ourselves as being in poverty. You know, we're fine. We survive with the help and support of each other.
So they never told you it was about benefits?
No, they did not.
When did they tell you it was going to be called Benefit Street?
About 2 weeks before the show aired. That's when, and it wasn't even done officially. I think someone just actually let slip that it was called Benefit Street, and that's when we all went absolutely mad. We went...
What did you think it was going to be called?
Well, they actually asked us for, you know, suggestions as to what maybe we think the show would be called. Some said Friends with Benefits, others said We Will Survive. Obviously, the kids made their sort of, you know, ghetto this, you know, that's just the teenagers. So why bother asking us if they already knew what they were going to call it?
And when you found out it was going to be called Benefit Street, you said you went mad.
Yeah.
Did anyone try and change that or pull the show or step in?
Obviously, we hadn't viewed the episodes by the time when we actually found out it was going to be called Benefit Street. We did make calls to Channel 4. We did make calls to Love Production, not just me, quite a few of the residents. And at the end of the day, they'd named the show what they wanted to name the show. So no matter what we did, they had no intentions of pulling it or no intentions of renaming it.
They told us that this was a fair and balanced reflection of life on the street. Would you go with that?
No.
What would you call it?
How could it be a fair and balanced when basically all they're doing is focusing on 4 or 5 people? Most of the people they have focused on don't actually live on the street. They spent time with many working couples, pensioners.
So they didn't live on the street?
No, they did, but quite a few people that were shown in the programme don't live on the street.
They told us that contributors were briefed extensively before the show was aired, and they've been in regular contact since. Is that right?
They did not brief us extensively as to the name of the show.
But just about the name. They briefed you about the show, did they?
No, they didn't. Basically, we've got like a local councillor who's actually got written confirmation saying the show is about community spirit. There are quite a few people who have it in writing what the show was supposedly about, and it wasn't benefits.
And at the end of this experience, how do you view Channel 4 and the show itself then?
I think they were very clever. I mean, obviously, we can't regret. We've done it. It's happened. People are talking about it. But basically, I think it's just the fact that it's sort of them against us. We've got no reason to lie. Why? You never said it to us, so why?
Did they lie to you?
Yes, they did.
People will be watching this and saying many on your street, have done pretty well from this. You've rocketed to fame. You must be making money from this now, aren't you?
Not necessarily, no. It's like a lot of people do presume. I think a lot of people presume that the second you appear on the telly, all of a sudden you're getting money. It doesn't work like that. Am I getting paid for sitting here tonight?
Your agent said that you've had a lot of offers as a result of this fame.
I have had a lot of offers, yeah.
And are those offers that you're getting paid for?
Not all of them, no.
But you are getting paid now?
If I accepted the offers, then yes, I would. But obviously, I haven't accepted anything at all at the moment.
So you haven't made any money yet from this?
As of this precise moment in time, no.
Why not?
Well, because I don't know. It's like, if someone offers me to go on a radio station, basically I'll go on the radio station. It's kind of basically I'm having to justify myself, and and sort of say, well, hang on a minute, what you've seen is just a little bit of my life.
You're still on benefits now?
Yes.
And do you intend to stay on benefits?
Not if I start getting an income, no.
So is that the direction you'd like to go in now? You would like to earn money from this now and come off benefits?
Not necessarily from this, but obviously I'd like to get a job, yeah?
But a lot of people will be watching this and saying, hang on a sec, you're on what, £214 a week?
Yeah.
Why would you carry on claiming those when offers have been coming in? We know you've spoken to your agent who says that there are these offers on the table now, which would mean you could leave that whole life behind. Why wouldn't you take that?
I don't want to leave my life behind. I'm not
Your
saying...
life on benefits, though.
Oh, yes, that's a different kettle of fish, yeah, obviously. But just because there are offers on the table, It doesn't mean I'm going to get, you know, money today, tomorrow or next week.
But you're still getting money from the taxpayer then, as things stand, right?
I'm still on benefits, yeah, because I'm not receiving any other income at the moment.
And you've been asked to be on Big Brother. Is that something you'll take up?
Not necessarily, no. I've got a lot to think about. It's like they have approached, they haven't made any offer. I don't know any figures involved. I haven't signed anything.
What about other jobs? I mean, the doors must be open to you to do a lot of other things now. Are you applying for other jobs now?
I'm not applying for jobs at the moment. I still have my down days. I still have my up days. It's like I've just been thrown into the public, and I'm not 100% sure how to cope with it because I've never been in this situation before, with people wanting to talk to you and interview you, and I've just never, you know, it's completely new to me.
Deirdre Kelly, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for talking to us.
You're welcome.
We're going to take you through a look of some of the papers before we go tonight, and there's one which has taken the front page of the Daily Mail, and it's quite a striking headline, this child porn number 10 aide arrested. They're saying that one of David Cameron's closest aides has resigned after being arrested on child pornography allegations. Perhaps we can go to Laura. You've been looking at this. Laura, can you shed any more light on what it involves?
Number 10 has confirmed tonight that one of David Cameron's advisors, a man called Patrick Rock, who was the Deputy Director of Policy, was arrested in the middle of last month over allegations of child pornography over a potential offence relating to child abuse imagery. Now, Mr. Rock resigned pretty much immediately. He's now not in his post. Number 10 has arranged for police officers to go in and look at any files or any IT that they see as being appropriate. And from what we understand, there were previous allegations of harassment made against Mr. Rock while he was working in Downing Street, where he's been since 2011, not associated to these potential charges, but interesting nonetheless. And this is tricky, embarrassing also for number 10, not just because of the, I suppose, the humiliation of the police having to go into Downing Street over such kinds of allegations, but also because when Patrick Rock went into Downing Street, he was seen as somebody who was very well trusted. He'd been in the Conservative Party for a very long time, and indeed had been close to David Cameron for a long time. They were special advisors together back in the late 1990s. So this is an embarrassment, definitely a blow for the Prime Minister, the arrest of his fixer, as some people saw him, Patrick Rock.
Has there been any word from him this evening?
Not as yet. We have got no official statement from Mr. Rock, but one of the things that makes it doubly awkward is that he was involved in advising the Prime Minister on child internet policy. So something potentially particularly awkward, but absolutely right to point out we have no official statement from Mr. Rock himself yet.
Laura, thanks very much. Well, that is all for tonight, but Kirsty is here with much more tomorrow. Till then, from all of us here, good night.